Hi, welcome everybody. If you could just come and sit down now, please. So thank you. I'd like to welcome you all to Circle 6. I don't normally sound like this, but I do today. So one of the reasons we created this venue was because we're so fortunate to be in this building designed by Harry Seidler under this ceiling designed by Pierluigi. And this was originally an exhibition space that had sort of semi-public access. So we were really keen to open this up and to use it in a kind of semi-public way that everybody can appreciate. There's a slide there. I probably should have said who I am, yeah. Richard Francis Jones, Design Director of FJC Studio. And what I want to do first of all is hand over to Corey Kenny, who's going to do an acknowledgement of country.
Hey everyone. So I'm always happy to acknowledge the Gadi people who are the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today. We need to recognise their ongoing custodianship of land, sea and sky countries and pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. So this evening we're going to be talking about words versus images. And, you know, it may seem that we live in a time when we're absolutely overcome by images, that they spill over us before we even have time to attend to them, let alone read anything. And architects, you know, perhaps have had a fraught relationship with words. We're not famous for actually being able to write. Often architects struggle with the written word. We're much more comfortable drawing something. And it's pretty much impossible for an architect to talk in public without a lot of images. You know, that'll just terrify pretty much every architect to do that. I myself regularly give 30-minute presentations that approach 500 slides. You know, I'm not kidding. On the other hand, once you get architects talking, you can't shut them up. I don't know what it is, but you can't seem to shut them up, particularly if they're talking about their own work. Not that you will necessarily understand what they're talking about. That's not necessarily the case. So architects have this very difficult relationship with words, and maybe architecture itself has a relationship with text and words that is worth uncovering and exploring, which is what we want to do tonight. And we're very fortunate to have with us Timothy Alouani-Roby, and I will tell you a little bit about him. He's a writer and editor of InDesign, Live, and Habitus Living, and he worked as an elite sportsman for many years before he actually retrained in architecture at the University of Sydney. And what is also interesting about Timothy is that he also has degrees in philosophy, politics, and English literature. And I remember when I first met him, and he was actually studying architecture, and I wondered why he was doing that. You know, like having swum around in such beautiful areas and fields, why come to this messy, difficult one? He's originally from northern England, and he's a student of Moroccan Arabic, and he divides his time between Sydney and Marrakesh. So would you please welcome Timothy?
Thanks, Richard. Welcome, everyone. Thanks to FJC Studio for inviting me tonight. And also let me just acknowledge country as well. Every day we live, work, and gather on country here. Always was, always will be. So while there aren't too many slides, there are some images, I can promise. And we're here to talk about the relationship between architecture and writing. And I wanted to start on a personal note, which is to say that, as Richard hinted at, it was actually the process of studying architecture which finally gave me the confidence to take my writing more seriously. And that might seem a little bit contradictory, But it gets to the point that I want to start with, which is this very deep-seated, a sense of a very deep-seated connection between the two fields. That this long-standing sense that I've had that there's something really closely linked between architecture and writing. And it's something that's captured nicely by this, something that I learned from Michael Tower at the University of Sydney. The Egyptian goddess Seshat, or Seshat, was actually the goddess of both writing and architecture, which I think speaks to some sense of long-standing connection between the two. I kind of often say that it's almost like a point about synesthesia, that when I write or when I read, I feel like I experience texts spatially, and when I think about and experience architecture, I also experience it on some level like a text, like your senses kind of mix. Anyway, tonight, we've structured this a little bit like a book. There are 3 chapters, basically, to help orientate us as we go through fundamentally thinking about the different ways that architecture and writing relate. So I'm going to talk about writing about architecture. I'm going to talk about writing as architecture, and then flip it around to architecture as writing. And these are really intended as 3 ways in, 3 provocations, top-line provocations, really, or suggestions for how we can think about this relationship between architecture and writing. So, chapter 1, writing about architecture. And I'm going to start with what I think is the most obvious field of connection between architecture and writing. It's my day job, for example, design journalism, writing about buildings, writing about projects, interviewing architects, doing the occasional book review, books such as Richard's, monologues of practices and architects, theoretical books, academic books. In the most obvious sense, this is just what it, this is the thing that would come to mind when we think about writing about architecture. And the simple point that I want to make about this is that when we're actually in architecture, we don't deal with the thing in itself actually all that often, the thing in itself being the building, right? So the work of architecture, the physical bricks and mortar. A lot of the time that we spend in and around the field of architecture is designing the thing before it's a physical reality, or at my end of the business, we're writing about things at a distance and people are reading it in magazines. So the way that I would capture this is a lot of what we deal with in architecture is effectively a form of representation, right? And I don't mean that as some kind of trite postmodernism relativistic point. It's just that architecture, they're big buildings, they only exist in one place, and a lot of the time we engage with them at some kind of distance. They're mediated through some other form, right? The simple point that I want to make here is that I think we sometimes have a bit of a misplaced hierarchy around those representations. So we all, I think, work under the assumption sometimes that images are in some sense primary, that an image of architecture somehow is closer to the truth, or is more valuable, or is better with architecture. So think about being in architecture school, or the way that I review pictures every day. We always go to the image first, and the text is something that you might do afterwards. The design statement is something that you might think about afterwards in a career at university. So this isn't to say that words are, and we kind of mischievously called it words versus images, but this is not to say that images aren't valuable. It's just to throw out the idea that have we undervalued the place of words, given that they're all different forms of representation. So I'm going to try and summarize as we go here, because we go through a few different sections. Basically on this first point, and as you can see, some of the images here are from some of my work in magazines, and it's kind of captured here how we have an image and words next to one another. I think photography, drawing, videos, they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. If you want to think about the geometry of spatial planning, an accurate floor plan is the best way in. If you want to think about the vertical dynamics of a design, a section is going to be your best way in. If you want to think about the atmosphere of being in a place at a certain time, maybe a watercolor sketch would be the best way in. I just want to suggest that writing brings its own very specific strengths and weaknesses, and I feel like sometimes in our wider field we undervalue the strengths that writing can bring in. So staying within this chapter 1 section of writing about architecture, I just want to go a little bit deeper away from journalism and general books and think about, I guess, what we might call a literary treatment of architecture. And I'm going to bring an example up from Umberto Eco, the Italian novelist, in his novel The Name of the Rose. This is the only relatively long piece of text tonight. I'm not going to be reading long pieces at you. But it's a very short little exercise, like a little provocation, if you will, where I want to flip that assumption that we often have that the image comes first and the word comes second in architecture. And I'm going to read a very short passage that is a description from this novel of an architectural part of the story. And I'm going to read it out, and we're going to come to the image afterwards. So instead of image and word simultaneously, or instead of image first, we're going to very consciously do it the other way around. And so all I would ask you is to really concentrate for a second and concentrate on the mental image that forms architecturally through reading a literary description of architecture. So, bear with me. 2 straight and unadorned columns stood on either side of the entrance, which opened at first sight like a single great arch. But from the columns began 2 embrasures that, surmounted by other multiple arches, led the gaze as if into the heart of an abyss, towards the doorway itself, crowned by a great tympanum. A tympanum's the name for the big piece over a church doorway, for anyone who's not sure. Supported on the sides by 2 imposts, and in the center by a carved pillar, which divided the entrance into 2 apertures, protected by oak doors reinforced in metal. The silent speech of the carved stone, accessible as it immediately was to the gaze and to the imagination of anyone, for images of the literature of the layman, dazzled my eyes and plunged me into a vision that even today my tongue can hardly describe. So for me, that creates a really vivid mental image, maybe not a complete mental image, but words, an architectural, physical, spatial description like that creates a really vivid image for me. And as you can see at the end here, the language of speech and vision is linked with things like silent speech, images, plunge me into a vision. So the next slide is a couple of images of the kind of thing that I think Umberto Eco is talking about. So before we come to a little bit of a pause, and Richard's going to step in at this point, the question that I want to leave lingering for the room is, what is it like to see the image after the word? What kind of advantages did a written description bring to this architectural form or sculptural form that a photograph maybe missed? And the kinds of things that I would suggest are an advantage of the writing there are, well, to put it really simply, you know, we all have a favorite book and then it gets turned into a film, and all of a sudden nobody can think of Lord of the Rings without imagining, what's the name of the actor who plays Frodo, and the New Zealand landscape, right? And there's some sense in which the image being given to you robs us a little bit of some of the work, or at least it gives us a shortcut. And there's a beauty in forming that image yourself. I also think it has real advantages there in terms of making us think about details really precisely, as well as mood and perspective and atmosphere, because often, in this case, it's a first-person narrator, which might be matched with something like a watercolor, for example. So that brings us to the end of chapter 1, and I think Richard might want to continue with some provocations at this point. Yes. Shall I give you the slide as well?
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. So, yes, we have it in 3 parts. So I'm just going to interrupt Tim a little bit, and then at the very end we'll have the most important part, which is discussions and questions from everybody. So I did something pretty dumb at this point. So I thought, well, we can't really talk about words today without talking about large language models, ChatGPT. So I put this question into ChatGPT, which I have to confess, I only did it about an hour ago. And I heavily edited it so it's a bit easier to read. But this is what ChatGPT had to say. The drawings and photographs show what something looks like, but the written word explains what it means, why it exists, and how it should be experienced. Written texts such as manifestos explain the thinking behind a design, intentions, symbolism, and potentially even social impact. Writing makes architecture accessible. It helps translate complex spatial ideas into everyday language. Writing provides records, context, debate, interpretation. Critics and historians use it to analyze architecture over time. Writing influences how architects think, not just what they design. The written word is just as important as drawings and photographs in architecture, but instead of showing space, it explains, questions, and gives it meaning. That's the irritating thing about ChatGPT. Admittedly, I edited a bit, but it's not so bad. But obviously, ChatGPT is heavily weighted towards words, right? So of course it's going to come up with an answer like that. So when we think about this hierarchy between drawings, images, and words, right, it is so difficult to compare them. You know, I tried to do it. I tried to think, well, you know what? I think the drawings are the most important thing, right? And I think the drawings are the most important thing because they are a level of abstraction that allows you to assemble the entire thing in your head, right? And analyze it from an experiential level, but also an analytical level, right? I thought drawings number one. Images are limited, they're immediate, and they're restrictive. And text, of course, depends on the text, but that is the most abstracted, it's the most distant, and it demands the most time, right? It demands time from you, slows you down, separates you. And at that point, when you have a text, and I think your illustrations from literature really go to the heart of that, is that we work through our imagination at that point. Assuming the text isn't just, oh, on the drawing on the left you can see the living room and then there's the blah, 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 and it's 6 meters away. Provided it's not purely descriptive, then it works through our imagination, which is a key into architecture in a way that is certainly beyond images and possibly beyond drawings. Your hierarchy?
Well, I mean, the thing that strikes me at the very end of that is the word imagination is obviously imagination. So unless anyone's a etymology expert on the spot, it speaks to that very, very first point I made, which is this sense of deep connection between the two. Even as you were reading the chat or the AI prompts, what comes through very strongly is the sense that writing is always this, like it's more cerebral. It's further at a distance because what it can do is, for example, it explains, right? And it's almost like that an image is more naive in some way. An image is less didactic, or it's more raw, or something like that. And again, I'm just not sure that's always the case. I feel like what these prompts miss are a descriptive language, like the one we just looked at, which forms an image in your mind. Imagination, it must be very close. Like, I mean, even I used the term form a mental image when I asked everybody to think about that text, so.
Yeah, and you know, I think because architecture is a physical thing, you know, there's a physicality to it. You got to make it, you got to lift stuff, right? It's almost the opposite in one level of an intellectual act, you know. And yet you get people like Alberti, who wrote his whole treatise on architecture, and he didn't have one image, right? One drawing, because he thought that architecture was actually intellectual, was something that told us something about ourselves, and that was in our minds as much as it was to be experienced through our bodies. Maybe chapter 2.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, let's move to chapter 2 to quickly reorientate ourselves. So chapter 1 was writing about architecture. Now I want to think about writing as architecture. What that really means is thinking about the architectural or spatial qualities of a piece of writing. Okay? So the kinds of things that I'm thinking about here in a written text are texture, surface, rhythm, structure, scale, classic, the bread and butter of architecture. And what is it to read something with these things front of mind? A quote here from André Tavares in a book about architectural books, so very relevant to what we're talking about. He says that in buildings as in books, architects set up sequences and logical paths that generate meaning. Both, and that is books and buildings, both formats offer similar strategies by which to physically grasp spatial experiences. So there's an example at the end here of the kind of thing that I'm thinking about when I say architecture is writing, and this is the comparison or the analogy between pages and rooms, or I would say between chapters and rooms. So what happens when you go and read a novel or you read a poem and you think about the chapters or you think about the stanzas explicitly in architectural terms? So to tackle that question, I wanted to throw up another literary example. This one's even shorter, don't worry. It's going to be one sentence that I want to read out. And just let me contextualize it first. So it's from a short story called The Library of Babel. Some people might be aware, by the Argentinian writer Borges. He was writing in the middle-ish of the 20th century. Now, the quote that I've got is from early on in the short story. It's a very short story. It's barely even 9 pages in my version. And on page 2, so page 2 of 9, there's a statement that basically tells us that there is going to be a main event. There's going to be a hero moment. As he puts it, there's going to be a solution spoken about. And then he also immediately tells us that before we get to that main event, we're going to go on a few tangents and we're going to talk about anecdotes and details and a few other little things here and there. And it turns out that the narrator is telling the truth. That exactly is what happens. So we're basically given a promise of deferral, of postponement. And for the next 6 or 7 pages, we go on a little meandering journey through a few kind of weird anecdotes and different little places in the story. And then we do return, as promised, to the solution in the very final paragraph of the story. So the sentence I'm going to read out is basically a clause. It's basically a promise that we're going to come to a main event, and there's going to be a slight diversion until we get there. Now, the point that I'm making with all of this, in terms of writing as architecture, is to think and understand this as a kind of architectural structure. Okay, so just in the same way that you might design or analyze a house and understand that its hero moment is a hearth and a double-height living room with a view, but you're not going to give the visitor immediate access to that. You're going to give them a glimpse when you walk in through the front door. You're going to give them a material cue or clue. And then you're going to take them through some compressed spaces and you're going to remove the view before you come back to it. Or it might be a main plaza in a piece of transport infrastructure, or any kind of work of architecture where there's a clear hero moment and we go through a process of hide and reveal. So that is exactly the kind of thing that I think Borges does in this story. This is the sentence that I pulled out. So before summarizing the solution, whose discovery, in spite of its tragic projection, is perhaps the capital fact in history, I wish to recall a few axioms. So if we strip the language back a little bit there, it's basically a clause. Before I give you the main event, I'm going to take you somewhere else first. Now, to me, that is very, very comparable to what an architect does in composing a series of spaces. It's the pattern of, as I say, hide and reveal, or compression and release. And then the experience for me as a reader in that story over the next 6 or 7 pages is one of kind of getting lost in this labyrinthine space where we get these funny little anecdotes about a philosophical puzzle here and a shelf of the library there. And you almost kind of forget where you are. You lose your bearings a little bit, which is the point, I think. Because as I said, you then at the end are given the release, the climax of what he calls here the capital fact in history, the solution. An interesting exercise that I'd maybe suggest for anyone interested in these kind of topics is, if you're reading a work of literature, a short story, a poem, a novel, how would you start to render some of this stuff in image form? And the terrible little sketch on the right is my attempt at just grasping how I understood this short story, right? So you kind of enter on the left and you're given a glimpse to the top right of the octagonal or hexagonal main event space. You're given a promise that we're going to get there, but before you do get there, we go through a series of, as I say, those small anecdotes and the little puzzles and all of these little rooms, and you're not quite sure how they relate to the whole plan, but then you do break out into the main space at the end. So to summarize this section, I just want to say that I think the author here is composing his story a little bit like an architect organizes a building. And I really think that our experiences as readers and writers, for example, is heightened if we think of this kind of structure in explicitly architectural terms. And the claim I'm kind of making here, it's stronger than just, oh, this story has a bit of structure and that's a bit like architecture. Like, great, that's quite a banal point to make. The claim I want to make is a little bit stronger than that. It's that the two experiences of the composition of a building and a story like partake of some kind of the same creative substance. So we're still in chapter 2. I just want to completely change tack for a second and talk about another element of writing as architecture. So again, we're thinking here about what are the architectural spatial qualities that we might find in writing. And this is a point about the sheer physicality, the sheer spatial presence of writing. In this example, it's a work of architecture in Fes in Morocco. And we're effectively looking at relief or sculpture. And what it brings to mind for me is that writing almost always in almost any context does have spatial pertinence. It does have architectural relevance. Here in this example, it's placed very deliberately on the column, and you can see how below it there are tiles where the writing is in 2D, and then the writing above is in 3D in relief form. It brings to mind how the first writing would have always been on clay or in stone, and therefore would have had 3D qualities, not just 2D qualities. So it's simply to say that I think writing kind of inescapably has physical, spatial considerations, as much as we might instinctively think that it exists in this digital vacuum and it's something that you can do on a keyboard these days. For most of human history, it's been a physical act, and that's probably why the Egyptians had a god for both writing and something physical. In this particular example, it's obviously layered with all kinds of different significance, architectural, symbolic, religious, and aesthetic. And I think that's another point for Richard to come in with some provocations.
Great, thanks. So those two things, I think the architecture in the text, and then in a sense the text as the physicality of the architecture. And you know, it's so interesting to try and compare art forms, I think, and realize what is so consistent about them, and yet what the great differences are. And in text and in writing, there is, in fact, the author has a control of the experience of the sequence of the temporal nature of reading, far beyond that of the architect, you know. And yet, I think thinking about it as patterns and compositions is really interesting. And one of the points that I would make to you, or question I would pose all of us, is if we go to the nature of the creative act, if we look at the way architects make architecture, and say we compare three very well-known architects to do this, like Louis Kahn, Le Corbusier, and well, take those two for a moment. So one conceives of the entire thing almost as a complete formal completion. Right? Louis Kahn, you can't move anything. Right? It's like a fixed thing, and if something changes, you've got to change the whole thing. Right? Le Corbusier, it's a much more plastic idea, right? It's much more malleable. He's able to respond to things that change. And then if we take Carlo Scarpa, it's like he starts here, right? And then he finishes somewhere else. Who knows where it's going? And that, in a sense, is like a different author would write a story, right? I mean, some authors start at the beginning, right, and just keep going. They don't pattern it out. And on the physicality of text, I put this building, the PSFS building in Philadelphia, probably from 1932. LaCraz and Howell designed the building, very influential building, very important modern building. But the sign, right, so, and you know, the words, as important as any inscription on a temple, I would say, right? And now the building, of course, sordid history really, because, so this is Philadelphia Savings Fund Society, like pretty much the first savings bank in the United States of America. Every family started, you know, built itself up into an amazing thing. And there it is in Philadelphia, right? Of course, what happens is, you know, reform to the banking industry, blah, 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 blah. Suddenly it lost all the money, everything down the drain. But the sign stays, and the sign stays, and it's of great heritage significance, inseparable, right? So somehow the meaning of the words can move on. Maybe it gets completely interpreted, but it stays. And so I put these two here also. Project in Melbourne. It's the Hello House. Also extraordinary use of text, right? So how can we separate ourselves from these two? So, oops, I guess the question is that there seems to be a way in which texts and architecture move between each other quite freely, and in a way that move it, and that meaning is kind of evolved and changes over time.
It makes me think in this city, I always think one of the, how to put it, one of the really pertinent experiences in Sydney these days architecturally is coming in to Circular Quay by ferry. And you know, for example, the Salesforce building now, like one of the first things that you notice is the word Salesforce, and a number of other banks. I think there's Capital something or other. And I always think to myself, like, why on earth should they have that prominence from, in a contemporary setting with that particular company? So yeah, words on buildings are a whole other field that we might want to come to. We're going to get to questions fairly soon, I think. People can pick up on any of these themes that they like. But before we do, I will jump into chapter 3. This is the briefest of our chapters, so we're almost there. This is to flip things again and think about architecture as writing. Okay, so we just thought about writing as architecture. Now I'm thinking about architecture as writing, which is basically to say, what are the literary qualities of a work of architecture? What happens if we think about a work of architecture a bit like a piece of text? And the kinds of things I'm thinking about here is, I mean, it's basically about interpretation, questions of interpretation. And there's long histories of exegesis is the tradition generally of religious scripture, of interpretation. Hermeneutics, I'm not quite sure how you define it, but it's the general field of literary interpretation in some form. So what this really boils down to is questions of meaning. Put really simply, what does a work of architecture mean? How do we theorize that kind of question? When we talk about how do you read this particular building, how do we read the building? It's theorizing, philosophizing about the kinds of criteria and the kinds of considerations that we should think about with that. Now, obviously, there is a history there of leaning on fields of literary theory for some of these kinds of considerations. Many people in the room will, I'm sure, know much better than I do that the high watermark of theory days was the 80s and the 90s in the Anglo Academy, and it's not remembered very fondly. I understand that, but I do wonder if there's been a bit of an overcorrection. Okay, so the essence of a lot of that, at least in literary theory, is basically to be asking questions of meaning, questions of interpretation. For example, is it an author's intention that gives a story its meaning, or is it the subjective perception of the reader? Is it the social context in which it's written, the social context in which it's read? These kinds of questions, in my view, apply precisely to architecture in very similar ways. Is it the intention of the architect that gives a building a particular type of meaning? Or is it the experience of the user? Is it the experience of the countless users that come through? Do you have to know about the concept of the building to understand it properly and to estimate its worth properly? So all of this is really just to think of, like, to prompt us to ask the question of what does it really mean to read a work of architecture. We're not going to go into the rabbit hole of all the different parts of the theory of that tonight. Suffice to say that my provocation here really is, obviously we're always going to think about the question of meaning in architecture, but I wonder if we've lost a little bit of a way of theorizing it and thinking about how we theorize those kinds of questions. That includes at university, it includes in offices, and it very much includes in design, journalism, and media as well. So, Richard, these are your plans again.
Thank you. So, yes, like you said, the 1980s in particular were a really high watermark for literary theory. You know, we had Jack Derrida speaking at Columbia University. Not many people were building that much, so it was pretty intense, people drawing a lot. This, of course, is the Lipskin's Jewish Museum. And I think there was really important work going on in literary theory, really, really important work going on. And when architecture steps outside its field so directly, then it tends to do it in a really literal, kind of slightly dumb way. And a lot of that happened in that period. So rather than actually understanding the difference between the two and looking for, say, you know, concealed power structures or something in architecture, we just slap something on, right? And I didn't mean that. Actually, in the Jewish Museum, Lipskin's case, that was an exception in my extraordinarily important work. But also what I was interested in is this question of the text and the artwork, right? Or the image or the architecture. And one of the things that I found amazing is how text, how a concept, how an idea, how an articulation can change everything. Right? So if you take Paul Klee's beautiful painting here from 21, and then the pathos of fertility. So this is the title he gave the painting. He's very famous, of course, for these very poetic titles, but it's not the same painting, right? You don't see the same things in that painting. And I'll give you another example here. So you look at this beautiful drawing and you see, you feel something, it induces in you a certain response, right? In the absence of his title to the painting, which is the dance of the grieving child. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is how interwoven these two are, right? How they affect each other. And then perhaps his most famous painting, Angelus Novus, which probably many people know this, The New Angel by Paul Klee. But what's interesting about this, to then push it into a literary context, is what Walter Benjamin said about this painting, right? Which is almost as famous as the painting itself, maybe more famous than the painting itself, right? Because Walter Benjamin bought this painting in 1921, and he wrote this text shortly before he died. And I'll just read this out in case people haven't read it before. A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face turns towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he seems one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. I have to say, the first time I saw that painting, I did not see that. And it's, it's an extraordinary piece of text by an extraordinary writer who then, shortly before he committed suicide on his trying to escape Nazi Germany. So then, if you think, well, where is that in architecture? And so in the 1980s, there was an architect in New York called John Heddick, who taught at the Cooper Union, and he drew these drawings. And people started to draw architecture in that period in ways they hadn't drawn it before, and started to think about architecture in ways that they hadn't thought about it before. And there is that connection. Start to think about it in an anthropomorphic way. And then later, John Heddick didn't really build this, but this was built in Prague. And you look at these buildings, and you think, extraordinary buildings. They're in snow. But John Heddick also titled this work "The House of the Suicide and the House of the Mother of the Suicide." And you can ponder which one's which. But you can't see them the same after that. This is the mother. So, that interweaving of text and architecture, I think, is actually potentially so intimate, and we're completely changed by an interpretation, an insight, and a story that connects itself to an artwork or a building.
What those examples show is you might get a full interpretation like the Walter Benjamin one, but you might also just get a title, which isn't, going back to the point earlier with the AI stuff, that's not a essay-like piece of prose that's analysis and explanation. It's just a word that goes with something. And I completely agree, like it changes, to go back to that previous point about questions of meaning, it has to change the meaning of some of the titles with those Paul Klee paintings. Look, I'll finish it really quickly. Those are the end of our book chapters. I'm going to end on a personal note again with a little epilogue, which is just to talk about the design process. When I say this thing about how it was, seemingly paradoxically, it was architecture that allowed me to become a proper writer. And I'm really curious to hear actually if anyone has any kind of experience that they can, if this resonates with anyone. So we all know the kind of idea of writer's block and paralysis as a writer and not knowing the way into a writing project. And for a long time, I kind of struggled to get going with writing because of those kind of paralyses. But it was actually learning and experiencing the design process at university that unlocked a lot of that for me. And so the design process that I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with, you start with a brief and some parameters, and you get a program and some functional needs. So then you start to look for a bit of conceptual inspiration, and it's all pretty loose, and you might do a watercolor sketch, or you might start thinking about a material or a poem that inspires you. And then you'll start to hem that in and start to compose the whole. Oh, sorry, you'll do some site research as well. And then you'll start to compose the whole with a site plan. And then you'll start to move into the parts and, the particular rooms or how the particular buildings relate to each other, depending on the scale of the project. And then this intensifying process of zooming in and out between the part and the whole, and iterating that, and then finally editing it and hopefully building the building. Now, this process, I find, is a beautiful way to make writing happen. Instead of feeling lost because you're overwhelmed by the scale of a writing project, in the same way that an architect just has to find a way in, you might find your inspiration from a particular functional requirement of a brief. You might be inspired by a piece of sandstone in Sydney. You might be, there might be an archaeological discovery on the site, and it gives you a way in. That's exactly what I use for writing as well. And then I use this kind of structure, and I find that it works. So that brings me to the end of my points, so 3 chapters and epilogues. So I think we'll open up to the floor, is that right?
Great, thank you, Tim. So questions, comments, words?
Hi, my name's Lynette and I've been in the industry for 42 years. I'm posing a question to the audience because we're talking about words and imagery tonight, but we live in a world of inclusivity and yet we tend to forget about those that are visually impaired or the blind. And as such, words are far more stronger than imagery because they can evoke in them a feeling, a memory of touch. They can feel size, they can feel shape. It can evoke emotion and it can also evoke smell, sense of smell and hearing. So I would put that to the community tonight to have a think about that architecture isn't just necessarily for those that can see, it's also those that can't see, and as such the strength of word is far more powerful than imagery.
It makes me think about the point really early on when I was saying that I think there's a bit of a misplaced hierarchy. And actually my point, I think, is it's like an anti-supremacist point. I don't think any of these ways into architecture are superior to any other. And again, I don't mean that as some trite relativist statement. I think some have real deficiencies, that would be an example that you mentioned. A person who's blind, it's a major deficiency if they can't see plans and sections, obviously. But then I think we just have to think that for any given criterion, there is a benefit and there's a disadvantage to a given way of approaching and approximating that, and sometimes that is the written word.
If there's no one else. Hi, my name's Walter. I'm interested about the cutting room floor, actually, because in Eco's text and in Borges' text, there's some very direct, very architectural passages. The Library of Babel is described in exacting detail, as too is the Sacratum and the Scriptorium. They weren't mentioned, I presume, on purpose. You care to elaborate on that?
Yeah, you're very right. Deliberately done just in terms of tonight because I know that we've covered quite a few topics and I wanted to pull out one very specific point from each one. So it's a bit of a pragmatic, boring answer, but yeah, the reason is with the Borges example, I just wanted to pull out one piece of structure that I think could be understood architecturally, and I just chose the Eco novel because I thought it was a strong description of a physical form. But I mean, there's any number of ways that you could go into those texts architecturally. For those who aren't aware, like The Name of the Rose, I mean, the novel comes with a plan. It comes with a plan because the architecture of the building is, and not just the building, but the whole convent is so fundamental to the story. But I suppose my bigger point with that would be to address readers and writers. What are think of the enormous benefits that you could get as a reader, as an interpreter, by approaching that text and in a disciplined way, keeping the architectural criteria front of mind. That's what I did when I revisited the Library of Babel. I hadn't read it for years and years and years. And I revisited it in preparation for this talk and forced myself to read it through the lens that I explained, what are the architectural qualities of this piece of writing. And it's actually quite hard when you try to force yourself to do that because you start, there's an anecdote that starts talking about, a particular theme or a particular character, and I tried to block a little bit of that out and keep thinking about, no, what's the structure here? What's the texture? What's the scale? Are we zooming in and out? Are we in the whole or are we in part? And it's actually I think a really rewarding exercise to do that for the avid readers in the room. I recommend it. Which one, sorry? The Tower, yeah. I'd read it years and years and years ago as a philosophy student, so before architecture. Yeah, before architecture. Yeah, I think so. I think it really brings out new things to think about structure. But there's an openness to that. Like, I'm not suggesting that you read a literary text and like close off to certain meanings. But when I say thinking about the architectural qualities of a piece of writing, right, I really mean it. It could be like a texture that comes through to you. It could be, it's not bricks and mortar. We're not touching a piece of clay in the story. But like on that synesthesia point, it could evoke like a texture to you. You know, certain stories have a roughness, certain stories have a smoothness. But yeah, to answer your question, sorry, I do think whatever architectural knowledge I've picked up has absolutely enriched my engagement with literature and vice versa. And if there's one point for tonight, that's kind of it, that they're mutually enriching and mutually rewarding. Yeah.
Hi there, thanks for your talk. My name's Alan. I'm up from Melbourne for the day. But you've just reminded me of I think we were talking a lot about the 1980s. 1978, Robin Evans wrote Figures, Doors and Passages, which specifically tries to connect up text and image through the plan. It's a brilliant piece of writing that has kind of been forgotten about, but he talks about configuration as the connection between image and text. I mean, it's obviously a point of fighting against the image of modernism. But he talks about the social relations through the plan. So again, just to reinforce this idea of the plan as a connector between both, I think it's a brilliant piece of text. I think we should all go and read it again. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just really quickly on that. Yeah, I'll have to have a look at it. What I was going to say, I think part of this thing, we're talking about words versus images, right? But you can dig into what Richard hinted at the start, which is within the images category, there's all kinds of different things going on. And part of what's happened is this proliferation of, sexified online images and even, AI renders and stuff today. And it's a different thing if we, again, force ourselves to look at more like plans, for example. And then how that relates to text is really interesting. So I guess, where my criticism is coming is more that what you might call like the shallow end of imagery, which, computer renders would be a good example of it in a certain context.
Hi, my name's Mike. I'm a structural engineer, so a bit of an interloper. It's more as an observation. I love the text that you had up there from In the Name of the Rose, and then the image. And the thing that struck me was the image has so much detail, but it's from one point of view, and it's in two dimensions, and you have no way of exploring other than that point of view, although it's got incredible detail. Whereas the text, you're immersed in it, you don't have the detail, and you're using your imagination, but you are kind of immersed in it like you are in a room or something. But the photo is just a static single point of view, which I found really quite an interesting contrast.
Yeah, well, I mean, this comes back to the pros and cons of each medium, right? Because in a text, you can only be in one space at any given point, whereas in an image you can kind of see more, but then it's 2D. And the summary point to that, I think, is just, again, it sounds a bit, I'm trying to think of a more like a profound way of saying what sounds really banal, which is just, they're all different ways into the thing. And, some people go to a site, like say you go to some classical ruins in Greece, and some people connect with it by sketching, and, I'm sure a lot of architects do. When I say about the personal experience of being at uni for me and doing architecture, I still found that I would connect more with that ruin if I went and jotted down some thoughts, like some lines of written text. And I don't know whether that's just personal preference. I don't know whether it's nature versus nurture, whatever. But it's like the kind of image in my mind is the thing in itself can never really be grasped in and of itself. But there's all these different ways into it. And I mean, really, the richness of a thing is to be able to take on as many of those as you can, I think.
Yes, it's James Werrick. I really thank you for a very distilled and poetic exploration of this fascinating field. I laboured in a much more lugubrious way back in the 80s, looking at Jürger's Parliament. And I thought at that time I was critical on every possible front, but one of it was not enough words. And just a few in a glass case here and there, and not enough commitment to what is now very fundamental things that are under attack right now. But then this afternoon I was up in the reading room at the Mitchell Library, which is one of the great spaces of our city, in fact one of the great spaces of the world, I'd say. And that's a beautiful transition, that you come in from the portico through the lobby and then into that great space with the books all around you. It's filled with students these days. I don't think anyone has ever stopped to read the words that are inscribed in the sandstone wall of the lobby. Has anyone ever stopped and looked at that? Anyway, it's a quotation from Carlyle, who's not the most highly respected figure of the past, but it's a beautiful quote. It says, "In books lies the soul of the whole past time, the articulate, audible voice of the past. When the body and substantial..." Oh, I've just lost it. When the body... beg your pardon. Let me start again, everybody, because it needs to be read properly. In books lies the soul of the whole past time, the articulate, audible voice of the past, when the body and material substance of it has altogether vanished like a dream. Now, I think that in fact all those students who are in that space are experiencing that without actually having read those words. So in this instance, I think being didactic and having words like I thought Jürger should have done is probably not the idea to communicate ideological positions.
Yeah, I mean the reading room is very fitting. I should have had that as a slide for the talk. I mean, it makes me think of the example from Fes, right, where there's obviously a really long and profound history of using Arabic calligraphy, and especially with religious significance. But very few people in those spaces are actually stopping to. I mean, they're actually almost illegible unless you really take time to read the way that it's been styled aesthetically. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true that the point you finished on, that in many contexts you don't need to read the thing to glean the meaning of it. Let's just leave that one as a philosophical paradox.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Tim. I want to ask you, Tim, about, I guess, your day-to-day editing decisions. You use all of the above of what we've just talked about, and in the world of contemporary sexified imagery, more often than not, people don't appear in architectural images, or if they do, they've been staged in a way that it looks obvious or not quite real. And often then the words supplement what the image is trying to tell or what the magazine or the publication is putting together. We've talked in the past about the role of publications like yours, or just general how architects talk and write about their work to appeal to the common man, the people who aren't sitting here, that are sitting at home in their two-bed box in Gledswood Hills. What are the decisions that you make to find a balance between writing and not overcomplicating the language with images that tell honest stories, so that the everyday person who doesn't know architecture and doesn't know writing understands your point?
Yeah, there's a lot in that. Let me start by saying, on a pragmatic note, in the design journalism industry, where we get pushback, interestingly, is always on words, not on images chosen. So if we write a certain story or in a certain way, there's virtually never pushback in terms of how the images are arranged, styled, and so on. Obviously, they've been already shot in a certain way, so it's limited, but there's never really pushback on that element. But woe betide you describe the project in a way that the architect doesn't like, that's when you'll get pushback, which, to my mind, says something about the power of the words in that as well. But that aside, I remember hearing a lot at uni about this thing of, you need to have people in spaces in images to give it a sense of lived in. I don't really buy that, to be honest. It's certainly not in a lot of contemporary project photography. You often get these, really cliche staged or, the blurred images of people. Yes, it helps with a bit of scale sometimes, but I don't think I don't look for things with people in it necessarily. And then aside from that, on a slightly more prosaic level, I'm really thinking about showing all the different sides of a thing. So you want to see a project in the round, you want to see it from the outside, you want to see certain details, you want to see key spaces like certain thresholds and whatnot, and then you're trying to link that up with the theme that you're writing about as well.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Richard. My name's Mano. I'm an architect and I also teach. This is more a commentary rather than a question. So your talk today, I was reflecting on someone like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is a master of linguist, and his picture theory of language, how we actually understand the world is through the imagery that we think of when we read a word. He often said that miscommunications happen when people imagine the wrong image. He also very famously said, the limits of my world are the limits of my language are the limits of my world. So I just want to share with you, when I teach, especially in the junior years, it's frightening for students, and I often find it very helpful when I ask them to think of a word. Immediately they can actually relate it to an image, and from there the design evolves, and that fear is melted and it flourishes. So just want to say that the words are incredibly powerful because it relates to our imagination and our experiences, and so that, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mano. It makes me think of, on that first point about Wittgenstein, I feel like I want to kind of say the opposite. So if he's talking about the essence of things as images, some of the point of like the chapter 2, for example, is more in my mind kind of the other way around, that there's some kind of, like the qualities of written text have like an ontological significance. So the world is kind of made up in a textual way. I would to put that in a more banal way is like, in the Matrix, when they cut through to the reality and it's all the green text is actually the things that make everything up. That's more like the kind of thing that Derrida would say, I think, that the way the world is for humans is primarily understandable in terms of text and in terms of spoken language and written language and that kind of thing, as opposed to the image side of things. But maybe that's a little bit too partisan. Yeah. Was there anyone else?
Hi everyone, I'm Billy. I teach and I'm doing my PhD. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask, you have like writing about architecture, writing as architecture, architecture as writing. And I was kind of wondering about writing on architecture. So your images, your text that you showed, they're very descriptive, like they're narratives or they're books or they're images that show something. So what about a kind of text that is critical of architecture or critical of writing or critical of both? And I think, like Richard's example of the Libeskind or the architects of that period, they're very critical. So what is the role, in your opinion, on writing as a kind of critical practice and architecture as a critical practice? And then second question, just to throw it in there, I find it interesting that ChatGPT is like, you write to produce an image. So if you have something to say about that as like a description to get an image now, what is the role of that, maybe?
Yeah, goodness, thanks. Critical writing in architecture, yes, absolutely of profound importance. The thing it makes me think about is how even in architecture school, even in history theory, when you write an essay, you're supposed to include images. You're supposed to include a certain number of plans, and you kind of get told don't write too much prose without images breaking it up, which I think is wrong. I think images can have their place if needed. I think to critically mine anything, writing is going to be our most profound tool as humans to do it. That's kind of a point that's bigger than architecture. If I want to do criticism of music, if I want to do criticism of sports performance, if I want to do criticism of a hot dog that I just ate, then I think writing is the best way of doing that. As to why that is, I mean, this goes back to like the whole, I think about like ancient philosophy, Greek philosophy, and the kind of idea that to explore and to interrogate something is like a dialogue, and that you have to go back and forth, put a statement out and have a contradiction back to it, and you have to have this like dialectical kind of, that's something that words can do. But I also think that like, images have a part of that, absolutely. And the second part was words to prompt images. Well, that just tells you that words are more important than images. And I'll finish on that note. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everybody for really engaging discussion. Yeah, probably words are more important. And I think in terms of how human beings interpret and understand their world, it is through language. And so really there is extraordinary primacy. And it's been a really interesting discussion today. And I think the way in which words and architecture have such a sort of elusive yet deep connection with each other is something that I think a lot of us, and a few comments from people who are teaching architecture as well, but also those of us who work and practice, it is somewhat overwhelmed by the dominance of the image and expectations around image. And it does make it difficult to deal with questions of meaning, interpretation, and indeed criticism, when there is such a focus on the image. And of course, we're ourselves to blame in many ways. And I think going back to the very first question, which is about, it's not all visual. Right? I mean, architecture certainly, it's, you feel space, you don't see it. And anyway, I think it's been a really fascinating discussion tonight, and thank you enormously to Tim. Thank you, and please stay, and we've got some more food and some more drink. Thank you.